the Southeast Asia Center at the University of Washington.
Discussing politics in Indonesia under Jokowi presidency, public have been made laws in recognizing the president's ideology, political stand-up, and strategic policies. While on the other hand, when radical Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia organization, Joko Widodo appears in front of the public as a good friend of Pemuda Pancasila, an organization which has gloomy radical history in Indonesia 65 and 66. Many political observers relate Jokowi's style of leadership with Solonist characteristic, that is indirectness, or in Japanese, mbendol buri. How to understand Indonesian politics under Jokowi Widodo presidency? Present among us today, Dr. Max Lane, a writer and historian of Indonesia's politics, history, and literature with more than 40 years of expertise in Indonesia and Southeast Asian studies. He has published a number of books related to revolutions and mass movements in modern Indonesia, including a high-profile book, Unfinished Nation, Indonesia Before and After Suharto, published by Verso 2008. He has also translated works of Indonesia's greatest writer, Pramudia Anantatur, and most remembered dramatist, W.S. Rendra. To mention, few of them are Tours, Buru Island, Tetralogy, and Rendra's The Struggle of Naga Tribe. Dr. Lane's works have been very meritorious for representing Indonesian modern history among English-spoken communities and Southeast Asian studies milieu. Please welcome Dr. Lane.
Thank you, Dimas, and also thank you to the Center for Southeast Asian Studies for inviting us over for this week of class visits and talks. I forget exactly, actually, what the title of the talk is on the poster that was circulated, and I have a different title here and a different title here. But what I'm going to try and do is identify 3 or 4 trends which I think are happening in Indonesian politics and society, which will, I think, be determining trends in the next several years. How these trends will come together, we can perhaps discuss that in the discussion time, but I'm going to concentrate primarily on identifying those trends at the moment. I'm going to list 4 trends, but also make some comments about a 5th factor, and that's Jokowi's politics itself, because I'm not actually going to focus on his politics as one of the key 4 trends. As a kind of entry point into the discussion, I think it's just probably worth painting a very brief picture of the electoral, the developments that have taken place in the electoral sphere recently, because that just helps set the scene a little bit, although it's not the most, it's not the substance of what I want to talk about today. Whoops, what happened there? Ah, there's a page missing. Well, the page missing basically refers to the fact that in the lead up to 2014 presidential and parliamentary elections, we saw the emergence of a polarization in electoral politics. At the level of the 2 presidential candidates, you had President Joko Widodo on one hand, and the presidential candidate Joko Widodo on one hand, and Prabowo Subianto on the other. And this also reflected a division in some of the key parties, with Megawati Soekarno Putri's Indonesian PDIP, Indonesian Democratic Party of Struggle, and Prabowo's Gerindra Party, his own party, which he set up in alliance with the Justice and Welfare Party, the PKS, which is essentially a more or less Islamist party. conservative Islamist party. There were other parties in the game, with some on the side of Gerindra and some on the side of Widodo, but these were the two core poles of attraction, and that polarization between Widodo, PDIP on the one hand, with some other parties in support, and Gerindra and PKS and Prabowo on the other, has really remained crucial to party politics, at least, since 2014. A further development in this, as this polarization continues, is that since 2014, the pole of attraction, this pole of Gerindra and PKS, Prabowo, has attracted additional support from extra-parliamentary organisations. And probably the crucial one is, for the time being, is the Islamic Defenders Front, or FPI, headed by a man called Habib Rizik, who's presently self-exiled himself to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. This pole of attraction, this polarization, also reflected itself this year in elections for the governorship of Jakarta, when one candidate, the incumbent, known as Ahok, a Christian Chinese, supported or nominated by Jokowi's party, the Indonesian Democratic Party of Struggle, and most of the parties supporting the Widodo government on the one hand, and another set of candidates headed by Anies Baswedan, who was actually nominated, Baswedan himself, nominated by the Islamist Justice and Welfare Party, but also supported and nominated by Gerindra. So this polarization that we see is emerged in the lead up to and through the campaign for 2014, but has stayed, that polarization has stabilized as a fairly, as an ongoing pattern. And of course, in 2017, with the gubernatorial election, we saw a particularly interesting result in the elections, in that while Widodo won in 2014, in 2017 in Jakarta, it was the Gerindra-PKS combination that won the election. And it won the election actually with a bigger margin, although we're talking about just the greater Jakarta area, it won the election with a bigger margin than Widodo won the election in 2014. So, and not only that, in the 2017 election, in 2016, leading up to the 2017 election in February this year, the support of extra-parliamentary conservative Islamic forces for the Gerindra-PKS campaign was also crucial. And it was characterized by, you can see here, very large mobilizations. This is the mobilization that occurred on the 2nd of December. It was a mobilization called by a coalition of Islamic groups under the slogan "Defend Islam," and one of its main demands was that the incumbent governor of Jakarta, Ahok, Governor Purnama, should be put on trial and arrested for blaspheming against Islam, as he made really a passing comment in one of his speeches about a verse in the Quran, which was being interpreted by these forces to say that a non-Christian cannot hold a leadership position, or Muslims should not support a non-Christian holding a non-Muslim holding a leadership position in the country. You can see some of the slogans here: a call for jihad, defend agama, defend religion, and defend the state. Probably several 100,000 people attended that mobilization. So this is in December just 2 months before the governorial elections are scheduled, with the incumbent governor Ahok, who is a candidate, being targeted by these mobilizations. You can see here more photos of the demonstrations. Very, very, very large, mobilized by the Islamic Defenders Front, but also many other Islamic, conservative Islamic organizations. Some of them you can see on the banner there when they're holding their press conference. They were able to secure, as a venue for their mobilization, the main mosque in Jakarta, the Masjid Istiqlal. And it of course had it's seen as having a significant impact on the election campaign. Now, so we have this polarization with this grouping here, this political axis here, playing an important role under the banner of a fairly conservative Islam. But one thing I want to emphasize in relation to this is that it has a high religious content, so many of the people here will be calling for the implementation of Islamic law. Some of the forces that mobilize, such as Hizb ut-Tahrir, call for the establishment of a caliphate. So it has a religious and a religious political content under the banner of Islam. But it's not only that. It also, for example, has a very explicit anti-communist component to their propaganda, whether it's their magazines. This magazine I came across reported to be distributed in Jakarta, but I also came across it in Jogja. Very expensive production, glossy, under the banner of Islam, but Sharia. But actually most of the content was propaganda against communism. Also, the same group has a ability to send out SMSs on the smartphone, and there's quite a few networks like this, so you can, if you subscribe, you can get this constant anti-communist propaganda. Beware, communism is rising up again, which of course it isn't. There's no significant communist organization in Indonesia today. You can't say there's no communists in Indonesia, but in terms of a communist organization rising up, it's not true. And as I said, there's more than demonstrations. It's more than just the aksi or demonstrations. It's just also ongoing propaganda on the internet, through printed material, etc. Now, how is this polarization going to evolve? And what is it a polarization between? A conservative Islamic group, a conservative Islamic pole, which is also anti-communist, and I'll elaborate a bit further on that it's actually, we have to also elaborate a little bit on what anti-communism, in what they mean by anti-communism. How is this polarization likely to evolve? Well, I think I'm going to try and set out four factors or four processes which will impact on how this polarization evolves. In the first, or the four of these, the first is going to be the process of the erosion of the taboo about opening up a discussion about what happened in 1965 and how that's actually connected to a contestation of different consciousnesses. Also a second factor will be the contestation between class factions, and a third one will be ideological vacuum that's now there with the end of all the discussion of development and pembangunan. Those who are familiar with Indonesian history over the last 40 or 50 years or know that during the New Order period under President Suharto, the dominant formal ideology, which was repeated over and over again, was developmentalism. And there's a fourth factor, which is not on this slide, and that's the question of how the labour movement has developed. So, the erosion of the taboo. Now, in Indonesia, there's been an official narrative of what happened in 1965 when the military took over, and the left wing of Indonesian politics, all the left wing supporters of President Sukarno, including the Communist Party, were banned and suppressed, and probably 500,000 to 1 million people killed. Now, the formal narrative from the Suharto government was that A communist coup attempt took place, and B, the Indonesian population spontaneously took to suppressing them, that is, killing them. And as a part of that, as a consequence of that, of course, communism, Marxism, Leninism, etc., is banned. Now, during this period, there have been, I think you can say, there have been two aspects to sustaining this narrative. One have been formal legal constraints. So communism is banned, full stop. Many writers associated with the left, including Pramudia Anantatur, but scores of others were banned. Organizations and publications were banned. But there was no actually ban on, there's no ban saying that you're not allowed to raise other versions of what happened. But there was a taboo. No one dared say, no, that's not what happened, something else happened. Of course, the people who were most likely to want to say that, members of the left-wing organizations, or most of their leadership was dead or in prison, so they didn't have the agency to raise a different point of view. And the rest, the members who weren't jailed or killed, and society in general, the state pressed, the propaganda of the state meant that there was a very strong taboo about speaking about that. It wasn't the only thing banned. You could not advocate separatism, like in West Papua, and neither could you advocate atheism in an active way, because that would be in contravention to Pancasila, the state ideology, which includes belief in one God. So there was also been this taboo, therefore, against also as well against the discussion of the Islamic State. Now, since Suharto has fallen in 1998, the legal position has not changed. Marxism, Leninism is still banned. The Indonesian Communist Party is still banned. Jokowi the other day said, if the PKI raises its head, I'll smash it. The current president. So legally it's banned, and the government says it will enforce that legal ban. Although in the bookshops now you can buy books by D.N. Eroded, the chairperson of the Communist Party of Indonesia, and you can buy all sorts of books, translations of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro. You can buy them all in the bookshops. But the legal ban is still there. What the ability to buy those books in the bookshops reflects is that there's been this gradual but steady erosion of the taboo, the informal ban, if you like. And this has been a very steady process since 1998, but as time goes on, gradually also accelerates. Now, what drives the process of the erosion of this taboo? First of all, there's been the activities of people who were victims of the oppression in 1965. Groups of former political prisoners who uncover mass graves. In fact, 2 days ago it was announced something like they had uncovered and identified approximately another 100 mass graves from 1965. Even under Suharto, they helped the BBC expose the first mass grave. That was back in 1997. BBC documented that for one of their programs in the UK. There's been persistent work by academics researching 1965, putting forward an alternative version to that of the government. I've spelt the name wrong. There's Azri Warman Adam is very prominent doing that. Hilmar Farid wrote an oral history of what happened in 65, 66. He's now Director General of Culture in Indonesia, in the Ministry of Education and Culture. And Bonnie Triana, another young historian, who producing the magazine, there you can see Historia, which is now a monthly magazine and doing very well. In fact, they've just announced that they're going to employ another 60 journalists just to produce this monthly historical journal because it's being received so well. Here you can see a cover, Riwayat Palau Arit, the history of the hammer and sickle. So you can see they also produce the history of tempeh. They have an issue, history of tempeh, bean curd and so on. They cover all topics, but they're not afraid to also deal with this kind of issue. And coming out like this, it's with the alternative and different views of different historical narratives, that's also eroding the taboo. And then secondly, there's been increased escalation of work by artists. Theatre. In fact, you can see one such theatre piece on Saturday by Faisal Marzuki, the silent song of the Genje flowers. But there's been a lot of other theatre, fine arts, paintings. Just 1 month ago, there was an exhibition of paintings in the National Art Gallery with a theme about what happened in 1965. That's chipping away. And of course, people will also know the film made by the American documentary maker Joshua Oppenheimer, The Act of Killing, which has also been screened widely, not in the cinemas, but in small showings and via downloading from the internet. Also widely, it's been seen by more and more people in Indonesia, along with its sequel, Sound of Silence. Also groups like Nahdlatul Ulama, some of the youth groups have made documentary films also about what happened to victims in 1965. And then there's been the work of human rights groups, Contrast, El Salvador, quite a few. Not to mention also the National Commission on Human Rights, which produced a report on what happened in 1965. The report has not been publicly released, but the executive summary has, and the executive summary lays the blame on the state for the majority of the mass killings. So they were all tipped away. And then, of course, in the last, well, even before Suharto fall, but especially since then, there have been the emergence of openly new left groups. Quite small, but quite a new number. Amongst students, intellectuals, also in the labour movement, amongst workers. You have magazines like the website magazine Indo Progress, which is actually produced and edited by Indonesians who live in New York, but also with many contributions by Indonesians, in Indonesia. Left-wing kind of journal. The Pembebasan newspaper, another newspaper called Arajuang, quite a few others too, all with openly left-wing, openly socialist, and even openly Marxist political content. And they, of course, as you might expect, such new left groups also raised the issue of, what did happen in 1965, what are the other alternative histories. So all these things combined, chipping away. And then, of course, in November 2015, you had the International People's Tribunal, the IPT, which was held in The Hague, where a panel of international jurists heard evidence from victims from 1965 and studied a lot of documentary material and produced in 2016 a report also arguing that there was a systematic state-backed implementation of mass killings. And just to, not in the slides because it only happened the last week or so, but one of the institutes that holds American National Archives has also just released all the papers from the US Embassy in Jakarta, which now the digest of those documents has already within a week actually been translated into Indonesian and can be easily accessed on the internet via social media. So that's another chipping away. There's just more information and more actual activity. It's not just information that falls from the sky. There's conscious chipping away by all these sorts of groups on the taboo. But there's another aspect to why this taboo is been able to be so steadily eroded. And one is that, and this is a very important factor, and it precedes Jokowi, but Jokowi's, the current president, is operating in the same framework. Probably the most crucial thing is that even though the government, that is the state government, retains the same narrative as existed under Suharto, the state no longer aggressively enforces it. Probably the most symbolic manifestation of this is that from the 1970s through to 1998, there was the compulsory screening to all school children again and again and again for 30 years or 25 years of this 4-hour-long feature film, The Treason of the 30th September Movement / Indonesian Communist Party, made by one of the country's best film producers and directors, a highly, a film with high production values, very bloodthirsty and horrific in its depiction of what happened in 1965, and presenting the official version that not only this was a Communist Party coup attempt, but also that in the process 7 generals who were detained by the Cakryabawa armed army unit, the Presidential Guard, were not only later executed, but in the process tortured by women communists who gouged out these generals' eyes and cut their genitalia with razor blades. And if you go back and look at the Indonesian newspapers, including so-called quality newspapers like Kompas, back in '65, they repeated these pictures about communist whores and witches who carried out these torture on almost a daily basis for all through '65, '66. Now the state, symbolic of the state's hands-off approach, is that film is no longer screened. So that's 1998 until now. It's almost 20 years. No children have been forced to see that film again. And that's sort of symbolic of the current situation. Yes, the narrative is the same. Communism is still banned. The Communist Party is still banned. President Widodo will still say, if it raises its head, I'll smash it. But on the day-to-day basis, all the state backup, giving social weight to this narrative, that has not happened for the last 20 years. And with this gradual chipping away, it's even forced the current government, in its first few months, to hold an officially sponsored symposium to discuss what happened. And this is the Luhut Agus Symposium. Luhut was one of the cabinet minister in charge of politics, ex-military. Agus Wijoyo was a general, still a general, in charge of the one of the Indonesian defense institutes. They hold a symposium to discuss what happened. And that was also chipping away the taboo, because even though it has still not come out publicly with any clear outcome, in terms of chipping away the taboo, what was crucial was that ex-political prisoners, former members of the Communist Party, were invited as speakers, were invited as resource persons, who were present at the seminar. So were the historians who were presenting an alternative view to the official narrative. It was a government-sponsored seminar, which many people criticised because it didn't, it vacillated about what it wanted to say. So you can, and that's a valid criticism in terms of outcome. But in terms of the ongoing process of chipping away at the taboo, it was very crucial because it was all broadcast through the internet. You could watch it, so people could watch people who are former communist political prisoners giving their version of what happened, which 1 year ago or 2 years ago would not have been possible, let alone 10 years ago or 20 years ago, absolutely impossible. So, this, again, you've got now a situation that where this taboo is eroded. Of course, you get a reaction to it. As soon as the government held this symposium, people who were aggressively in favour of supporting the old narrative also held their symposium, with some of the key, most conservative ex-retired military people being a part of it, and also even the current Minister of Defence, who's known as a pretty hardline military guy, also part of it. So that was, and they not only attacked the Communist Party and so on, but also they attacked Agus Wijono, the general who was one of the initiators of the first seminar. And interestingly, another key participant of this seminar was indeed the Islamic Defenders Front, the FBI, which had been key instigator of those demonstrations against Governor Ahok that I mentioned earlier. So you can see that the polarization is also reflected around this issue. Now I put down right at the bottom here, notice other ideologies, because this is what we have to understand about the anti-communism. You can see here on the right here, a typical poster from this right-wing Islamic poll. They lump together, and this is very representative, they lump together liberalism, communism and atheism sama saja. Liberalism, communism and atheism are all the same, are the same thing. Or the top one, Indonesia will be peaceful without communism, radicalism, but by that they mean social radicalism and liberalism. For this Islamic anti-communist poll, communism is in some way a code word, not just, it's a code word referring not simply to communism, which in terms of a communist movement in Indonesia doesn't exist, but to this secular liberalism, which is also, which they see is increasing in influence. Here is General Agus Wijoyo, another typical banner coming out from this kind of, there's no actual group name there, but it's a sort of banner you get from this kind of. Agus Wijoyo, the general, he's also a communist. In fact, he's the chairman of the Indonesian Communist Party, according to this propaganda. So you get a very extreme kind of propaganda coming out, but linking all the liberalism, communism, atheism, linking them all together. But what do they mean by liberalism? Well, what for them is the main evidence of liberalism? Well, I think we can discern that probably a key issue that aggravates them most of all, or which they can also use to explain what they mean by liberalism, and they're referring to the political situation that's evolved since the fall of Suharto. So they're talking about the more democratic environment that exists now. And I think, if you listen to what they say in their speeches, what they refer to most of all as symbolic or as a concrete manifestation of this liberalism or this democracy is the ineffective enforcement of the old taboos. It's kebablasan. Things have got out of hand. Before, no one could raise an alternative view of what happened in 65. We know that things have become more liberal. What's the proof? Now you can raise an alternative viewpoint on 65. So the question of how you interpret 1965, or the fact that you're allowed to interpret 1965, becomes for them, one of the most concrete manifestations of the new liberal, i.e. democratic scenario which they oppose. But of course, as I said, with the chipping away and with the lack of state enforcement of the taboo, they're not really able to hold this process back, and they become even more agitated. I think the final point to make about the erosion process, which is a very significant change, is that when this, without state enforcement of the taboo, the groups, what enforcement or what attempt to enforce the taboo there is, comes from direct action by these right-wing and or Islamist groups themselves. Physical harassment of events. So you want to show, sometimes people wanted to screen the film, The Act of Killing. The screening would be broken up by 20 or 30 thugs or members of one of these right-wing groups. Quite common activity. So without state enforcement, you get this other kind of activity. But the reality is, this harassment by militia groups has not cowed anyone. Now, living in Jogja, some students want to screen a film. The local anti-communist association or Islamic anti-communist, number of different names used, say, we will mobilize 50 people or 100 people to break up the meeting. So I've seen incidences where that's happened, but students have mobilized a militia of their own of 200 people to keep the other militia out. Or where the meeting has been successfully broken up on a university campus, next week the dean of the faculty will screen the same film. So, and you can imagine, you can understand the logic of this. Without the state aggressively enforcing the taboo, groups in society itself, even when there is hostility from the more right-wing militia, they're not willing to be cowed. They're not facing the state. They're facing other elements of society. So I think this process of erosion of taboos cannot be stopped. It might speed up and might slow down, but it's not going to be stopped. And that's one of the trends that I think the struggle around the historical interpretation of 1965, which has become linked to whether you have democracy or not. It's not simply a historical question. It's a question of whether you will have the freedom to search for the truth and present an alternative. So the two issues, democracy and historical interpretation of 65, become tied together. So that's the first trend. The second trend, I think, relates to caste and class and caste dynamics. The crucial thing here, I think, is that if you look at the Indonesian masses, the working class, peasantry, ordinary people, popular classes, however you want to describe them, don't have any real capacity for agency or initiative in contemporary politics. The reason for that, of course, is that for 33 years under Suharto and even since then, there has been no political parties which have come from below. All of the existing political parties are either parties that existed under Suharto or splits from parties that existed under Suharto, or parties formed by organizations which existed under Suharto. Parties coming out of a trade union movement or a peasant movement or any kind of popular base don't exist. So electoral politics is very much a reflection of differences within the ruling class, within the economic and political elite of Indonesia. And I would argue that the key division at the moment, represented by Joko Widodo on one side and Prabowo and others on the other side, is a division between a division where you have Prabowo and also the Suharto children and several other key figures representing the interests of ex-cronies. So you can imagine that in under Suharto you have the emergence of 10 or 20 or 30, depending on how you measure it, very big business conglomerates. But all those business conglomerates developed as with the assistance of having direct connections with state power, in this case with Suharto, including Suharto's children, of course. So since Suharto fell 20 years ago, those conglomerates are still there, but they're no longer in the same privileged position of having close ties with a dictator, with an authoritarian central power. And they hanker for returning to being cronies. And I think the clearest manifestation of that is each one of them who wants to be a crony. Of course, now they have a problem. Which central authoritarian figure can you be a crony, can you link up with in order to become a crony? There's none there. So what you see is more and more of these ex-cronies, or people who want to be cronies, forming their own parties and putting themselves forward as presidential candidate. Then you're, of course, in the ultimate crony position. I think in America, someone said maybe you have a similar phenomenon, but anyway. So you have, Haritano, a big conglomerate, forms his own party. Prabowo Subianto, who he and his brother own a huge business empire. They have their own party. And within some of the other parties, some of the big conglomerates also maneuvering all the time. And competing with them are what I call the kabupaten capitalists, the district capitalists. Because in Indonesia, if you talk about the entrepreneur class, the capitalist class, you're talking about a huge number, or you're talking about, 500,000 or people or so, of whom only maybe 5% you could classify as having a lot of capital. Big capital, indigenous big, national big capital in Indonesia is very small. On the other hand, you have hundreds of thousands of small and medium capitalists, mainly operating at the district level. The statistics show that 95% of all businesses in Indonesia, of all enterprises in Indonesia, have less than 20 employees. And something like 50% have less than 10 employees. So you're talking about an ocean of small business. And in many ways, Widodo, who is a furniture exporter from the city of Solo, represents that big ocean of kabupaten capitalists. And his economic policies reflects that. He has basically only two key economic policies. One is provide infrastructure to the regions. Because if you talk to any district capitalist, district entrepreneur, they'll say roads no good, transportation no good, delivery no good, nothing on time, electricity closes down, etc., blackouts, etc. And secondly, deregulation, because the medium and small businessman in a district town will be always complaining about he'll need 50 permits to open a new business. And that's Joko Widodo's policy. Build infrastructure for the regions and reduce the amount of red tape. Full stop. Doesn't really have any economic policies beyond that. Whereas the conglomerate, the ex-cronies, they don't care about business regulation. They couldn't care if there were 100,000 regulations. Because if you're a crony with personal ties to the ruler, who cares about regulations? The regulations are put aside for money under the table, for large money under the table. So you get this split, and of course, related to this split is amongst the small and medium businessmen. They're much used to having to negotiate everything. The ex-cronies, harking back, either because they experienced the Suharto era or they dream about the Suharto era, they fantasize about it. They think negotiation, making compromises, all this, no, you just say it and it's implemented because you have centralized power. Whereas the Widodo kind, all the parties and figures and that from the rest of the social and business elite are used to it. Because you're small or medium, you can't just do what you want. You're in a constant, non-stop process of negotiating things. And I think that, in terms of the old phrase, social being determines consciousness, their reality of constantly negotiating and making small deals at the small scale level means they're more accommodating to democracy. You know, okay, you've got to have 10 parties, and the parties are going to do deals with each other. Whereas the ex-cronies, they fantasize about, let's trim down the parties to 2 or 3 again, and let's decide things, not by Twitter, but let's decide things, what do you call it? By decree, really. So that's a second trend which I think is there, and you can see there's an overflow with the trend of the emergence of an Islamic right, because here you see, for example, on the bottom right, you see on the poster, bottom right-hand corner, Habib Rizik, the leader of the Islamic Defenders Front. A poster for an event where they use Suharto's picture in Islamic dress to attract people, I hope. And here you have the current governor of Jakarta, who beat Ahok with Prabowo, and up there you have Islamic leaders from the right wing with Tommy Suharto. So there's an overlap between the ex-crony pole of interaction with the Islamic right. You see here just some comments from Anis and also Habib Rizik, again reflecting their support for Suharto. And if you go on YouTube and read or watch and listen to Habib Rizik from Islamic Defenders Front speeches, you'll see a constant criticism of liberalism and an explicit open defense of Suharto. The same as Anies Baswedan during the campaign, the current governor of Jakarta also openly defended Suharto. And most recently, after he became governor, 3 or 4 days ago, makes a speech criticising Sukarno. I mean, Sukarno was gone 50 or 60. Why does the governor make a speech criticising Sukarno? It's not on the Jakarta politics radar, but it's part, again, of this polarization, which includes includes this overlap with what you might call Suhartoism. I just show this also because this is Habib Rizik again, and he's sort of summing up what this from his point of view, what his perspective stands for. It stands for he doesn't actually propaganda against Pancasila. He argues we should still have Pancasila, the state ideology, but there is no contradiction between Pancasila and having Islamic law. This is important because the Suhartoists and Prabowoists would not be able to work with the Islamic right if the Islamic right explicitly was against Pancasila. So he is clever enough to make that compromise, although the other big organisation, Hizbut Tahrir, which has tens of thousands of members now in Indonesia, is very explicit. They want to get rid of Pancasila. They're very explicit. They don't believe, they say this on TV, and including in a mass meeting in Istora, the main sports stadium in Jakarta, which was broadcast live on TV. They say, we do not agree with democracy at all. We do not believe in the concept of popular sovereignty. Only God has sovereignty. And we must therefore follow God's law, which is the religious law. You want to know what the religious law is? The experts know, that is the ulama, therefore the ulama should be the ones who lead the country. I'll just switch a bit here. No. Because the third trend is the question of the ideological vacuum. I mentioned it briefly earlier that since Suharto fell, the ideology of developmentalism has gone. Again, as I said, if you followed Indonesian politics during the Suharto era, Pembangunan, development was everywhere. Suharto was Bapak Pembangunan. The Minister for Development Planning was the most important minister in the cabinet, etc., etc., etc. I would guarantee that if someone was interested in doing one of these, surveys of newspaper discourse, you would not find the word Pembangunan at all whatsoever since 1998, which is actually a massive shift from Pembangunan every day to no mention of Pembangunan at all. You might get mention of economic growth or Indonesia emerging as, becoming an emerging market, but Pembangunan with a capital B, that's gone. So what replaces it? That was there for 33 years. What replaces it? I think a part of it was replaced for a few years by we're shifting to democracy. So introduced direct elections, elections where you have more than 3 parties and so on. But once that was done, that was completed by 2013, President Yudhoyono implemented all those reforms to the electoral system and introducing decentralization. Well, that was started by Habibie. Now you've got, what now? Developmentism, not mentioned anymore. Shift to democracy, you can't talk about that anymore. That's already taken place. You have direct elections for president, for governor, for bupati. You can have 10 parties, 15, you can't have a communist party, but you can have 10 parties, 15 parties participate in elections. You have a free press. You can lampoon President Jokowi or whatever you like, however you like, in the press. No, of course you can't say, let's have socialism or communism, but everything else you can say. So that's another, that vacuum is another question, and the vacuum is also, because it's in a situation where, of course, most Indonesians live in a bad socio-economic situation. The Islamic, these are more Habib Rizik, where their posters, talk about Islam, but their entry point is actually social injustice, removal of squatters, poverty, corruption. So the Islamic right also appeal, their first instance of appeal, they say, your problem is you have a corrupt elite. Your problem is you're removed from squatters. Your problem is the government doesn't pay you attention. What's the solution? Islamic State. So it's not like they go into the village and say, oh, Islamic State, Islamic State. They don't, that's not what they say first off. What they say first off is you have this problem, you have that problem. Then what comes to the, then what's the solution? Actually, the Hizb ut-Tahrir has the same approach. I've spoken at many on university campuses where there's always 1 or 2 students put up their hand to speak in discussion time who are from Hizb ut-Tahrir. And they might speak for 3 minutes or 4 minutes. The first 2 or 3 minutes, you will swear you were listening to an orthodox Marxist critiquing capitalism. It's only in the last minute where they get to what the solution is, and the solution is a caliphate, and the example is the caliphate from several centuries ago. So it's, again, you have socio-economic underdevelopment, but no ideology of development anymore. So that vacuum is also a crucial thing, and it once again gives rise to people like this, but others as well. Habib Rizik again arguing what's the holistic solution to all these problems, and again he emphasizes united Indonesian Republic. So he won't be like Hizb ut-Tahrir and call for a caliphate. He'll say the same thing that the Suhartoists or Prabowo will say, united Indonesian Republic, no secession, Pancasila, yes, but also Islamic law and the ulama should play the leading role. The fourth trend that I want to briefly look at, I think I've given the wrong slide set to Adrian. What to do? Nothing. Can't do anything. The fourth element is labour, and the first thing to remember here is that under Suharto only one labour union was allowed, and it was managed from the top. And it wasn't actually, it was really more, to all intents and purposes, with some exceptions in some pockets, it was a union only on paper. But one of the first things that President Habibie did, and he did many positive things actually, was to sign all of the international conventions on labour with the ILO, and then to introduce a law about a year later, ratifying, like giving legal legislation which gave a legal basis to signing those conventions. So that since the end of 1998, it's been possible for people to freely, there's bureaucratic obstacles, etc., but more or less freely establish unions. So between 1999, 2000 and 2010, you had a mushrooming of unions all over the place. Probably by 2010, you had several thousand enterprise unions based in this or that business. And you had, by 1910, 7 union confederations. By 2017 now, you have 13 union confederations, plus a lot of other small unions based in this or that enterprise, which are not affiliated to any federation or confederation. Once that stabilised around 2010, 2011, some of the unions then became very active campaign-wise. They first tested out their strength, forming a coalition of unions together with NGOs to demand that the Parliament legislate a social insurance bill, which the Parliament was reluctant to do. But the campaign was very big, sometimes mobilising 50 to 100,000 people in demonstrations. And finally, the Parliament did introduce a bill to bring about the BPJS social insurance system, which has improved access to healthcare partially and for some people, but certainly more than existed prior to that. And that was a result of basically a union-led campaign. Having seen their success from that, the unions then, some of the unions then, or even most, you could say most of the unions then, decided that the next issues were wage increases, because the minimum wage was extremely low, while inflation was, for the goods that workers would consume, was increasing rapidly. So 2011 and 2012, they organised national strikes. Unfortunately, I can't put up the slides, but I'll pass these around. They're in black and white, but even so you'll get a sense for what was going on.
If you have your flash drive, Adrian, you may be able to find it on the computer if you're interested.
We can try and do that, Adrian, if you like. Look for UCL, look for labour, that file with labour in the title. And so 2011, 2012, the massive national strikes. In 2012, the estimation was 2 million workers striking around Indonesia. Let's see, it'll be a PowerPoint file. So go down a bit more. PowerPoint file. No, try Kuliaburu. That will have photos in it. Yes. Yes, I can see the photos there already. Now, these are the same photos as I'm passing around, so you can put that on big. So you can see on the left the workers in the black uniform. That's Garda Metal, the vanguard of the Metal Workers Union. That's a typical workers' demonstration down below. See the Garda Metal uniform, disciplined, general atmosphere going way back, red flags, red red T-shirts. Basically, wages and labour for wage rises and against labour hire, because in the factories 80% of workers are on labour hire where they're paid daily with no holiday pay, no sick plans. 80% of workers, which is actually illegal under labour law. You can't do that, but everyone does. This gives you a sense of what was happening in 2010, 2011, 2012, and even into 2013. Big trade union demonstrations. This again is the Garda Metal, the metal workers' vanguard. Highly disciplined, always at the spearhead of all marches and demonstrations, which gives all the other workers much increased confidence, self-confidence, with the police and army everywhere, to see these workers, disciplined workers up front. This is one of the labour schools there under the bridge, where the hundreds and hundreds of workers went through political education courses. At one time, thugs were called out, or the word went around on Facebook that thugs were going to disperse that. So you got almost 20,000 workers assembling, all carrying sticks, within 2 or 3 hours to defend that breach. There's some of the key activists. Again, you just get a sense of. I think we've gone through the pictures there now. So that gives you so when I'm talking about these worker mobilizations, I'm talking about something that was very real and scared the hell out of a lot of the employers at the time. And as a result, by 2012, late 2000, most of these big demonstrations were held in November or December, because they were the months when labour, when the minimum wage was decided every year. There's some more photos. But November, December 2012 and into 2013, the employers struck back. There are more and more gangs of thugs harassing pickets. There are more workers actually arrested by the police. The employers would bring charges against them, like damaging property or whatever, so that they could be detained, and eventually, after months, put on trial. And so there was that increased fight back from employers, but at the same time, that there was more pressure from employers. The union leaderships also found that at the base, workers were becoming more radical. As these mobilizations took place and people grew in confidence, there were some workers who were becoming more radical and emerging as another leadership at the base. So you had the trade union leadership facing pressure from above, police, army, thugs and employers, but also facing a threat from below. So at the end of 2013, you had the union leaderships change course. They signed an agreement at a big ceremony with the employers, the army and the police, that from then on all would be harmony. There will be no more escalation of these campaigns. But the important thing politically, why it's an important factor in how this situation evolved, is that this is 2013. So the presidential elections, if you remember, are in 2014, and the parliamentary elections too. In this reversal, changing direction, the best organised unions, the ones with these guys, suddenly announced they were supporting Prabowo and aligning with that Prabowo Islamic Conservative Alliance. They expelled from their union everyone who was otherwise inclined. They issued an excommunication decree that no union person could deal with the key pro-Labour activists in Megawati's party. So there was a shift to shift away from escalating mobilizations and strikes to trying to gain something, I presume, I think, maybe, for the unions by aligning with Prabowo. Although we have to note, maybe it's more opportunist because key union leaders were themselves people who had previously stood for election under the PKS Islamist party banner. So since that turn away from escalating demonstrations to supporting Prabowo, of course, the industrial relations scene has calmed down. There's still lots of small strikes and so on, but no big national mobilizations for increase in wages. In the gubernatorial election, all these unions supported Anies Baswedan, supported the Prabowo Gerindra gubernatorial candidate. But today I read in the newspapers, the new governor, Anies Baswedan, has signed an agreement for the 2018 minimum wage below what the unions hoped for. So all these unions that supported Anies Baswedan have now issued a press release saying they're withdrawing support. A bit late, actually, and a lot of workers' commentary saying, a lot of very cynical comment by union members on their Facebook, I read this morning, about what the leadership done, support the candidates before and then afterwards withdrawing support when actually it doesn't really, not going to really matter. So the question, just summing up now, because the question is how these four trends will evolve and how they will come together. And I think I like to include the labour sector because in my reading of what's happening, you have on the one hand this conservative, religiously coloured right-wing pole emerging with, also promoting the image of Suharto as symbolic of what they want to have. But on the other side, there's nothing. Dimas, in his introduction referring to Joko Widodo, was pointing out how, on the one hand, Joko Widodo, as president, has banned one of the most fundamentalist Islamic organisations, although I personally don't think the ban means anything, because all it means is they'll keep doing what they've always done, but under the radar, or even, even only half under the radar, really. But on the other hand, so he's against the right, so it seems. But then the next day he appears at the Congress of Pemuda Pancasila, a right-wing militia group, wearing their uniform to give a speech and praising them. So you've got the right wing there, is the religiously coloured right wing there. But what else have you got? I think on the main stage you don't have anything except, an implicit defence of the status quo. We don't want to go in the direction of more influence for Islam, conservative Islam. Where do we want to go? Well, they don't say where they want to go. So the assumption is that basically Indonesia how it is, but with better infrastructure and less regulation for the private sector. Because if the private sector, in Widodo's own words, if the private sector can get that freedom and back up, Indonesia will become a winning country. And that's the limit of his ideological perspective on the future. So I think we're going to have to look. I think the most likely place that we will get alternative ideological perspective will come out of the labour movement. So even as it switches right, what happens is that members become alienated and new, more left-wing unions are established. That's already happening. And then you have previously all the agencies I mentioned before who are chipping away at the 1965 taboo, the human rights organisations, the new left organisations. So I think what can provide an alternative to the conservative Islamic right is not yet on the main stage, but the potential agencies are there, both those chipping away the 1965 taboo and in the labour sector. So I've probably gone on too long, I'll stop there.
I think we have time for a discussion.
Questions?
Yes. Dimas.
Oh, me? Okay, thank you. My question is about Anies Baswedan and Islamic political movement in Indonesia. So in 2004, Anies wrote an article about political Islam in Indonesia. It's published in Asian Refugee Journal, and he predicts that in the future there will be more Islam-inspired laws and policies. And I quote it again: the Islam-inspired agendas are likely to exclude for formalization between the state and Islam. So it's like it's shocking that Anies also used Islamic movement as his vehicle to be Jakarta to be the governor of Jakarta. But this article is written in 2004. And it's like 2004 is the beginning of Reformation era. At that time, even Megawati is still the president of the. Then she lost her political appeal at that time. So, what will happen in 2004, and what makes him actually think that in the future he predict correctly that in the future there will be a emerging Islam politic power. So yeah.
That's an interesting point. But of course, even before 2004, all of the individuals and elements that formed the PKS, the largest of the actual Islamist parties now, were all already active under Suharto. So 2004 is in terms of this political current, conservative, right-wing political current with a religious colouring, in this case Islam, actually predates 2004. It's really 1990s. And I think for those who have a more, because even at that time you could start to assess, well, after Suharto goes, what ideologies will gain, will be able to grow. And the problem is, the situation is, as I've described just now, the only organised force with a clear ideological perspective is conservative right-wing Islam. What do all the others stand for? Megawati's party. Widodo. Yudhoyono. What? In terms of a perspective of where the country should go. And I think that's, even though it's not super explicitly articulated, I think that's maybe it's something which will become more prevalent in countries like Australia and the United States as well. But in Indonesia, except for a very small layer of people, no one is satisfied with the present. If you live in an underdeveloped country where the per capita income is only $4,000 US per year, and where infrastructure development is 100 years behind countries like Australia or the US, where access to medical care is, well, I won't make the comparison with the US, but where access to medical care is very poor. No one, in Australia, if I ask students, what about the future? The future's not an issue. It should be an issue, of course, but it's not an issue because people are experiencing the majority, not everybody, but the majority in Australia are experiencing relative stable prosperity. So why think about the future? But in Indonesia, people, they think about their children and their grandchildren in a situation of $4,000 everyone thinks about the future, so you can't negate if you don't have an ideological perspective that's future related, to all intents and purposes, you have nothing to offer in a society where people looking for a future perspective. So the only organised force able to do that under Suharto, and therefore the force in the best position to do it now is the religiously coloured Islamic conservatives. The mainstream that grew up under Suharto, pembangunan, development, economic growth, nothing else. Nothing else. Even the intelligentsia, nothing much actually. On the left, or grassroots ideology, because of the 1965 suppression, also nothing. So you've got a vacant field. So it's not surprising that someone like Anas, who would be part of the process of developing a conservative Islamic pole, would be thinking that way.
Yeah, so I was about to ask actually a very similar question of what makes the group of the cronies so effective in accumulating masses? Because if the huge masses are people who are unsatisfied with their prosperity, so my logic would tell they would go for the other candidate who don't represent the interest of the few. But
well, I think the first one is the cronies themselves, in terms of attracting masses to become active, to mobilize, have not shown the capacity to do that. The Islamist forces have, FTI, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and I sort of put up those slides very quickly earlier. They go into poor areas with policy, in the PKS did this in the early stage also, to give welfare, food, this, that and the other, plus the idea that the Caliphate or Islamic law or a bigger role for the ulama will help solve your material problems. The actual success of even Prabowo, but the others, Haritano or Suharto's, Tommy Suharto, in getting popularity is almost nil. Gerindra as a part, in Widodo versus Prabowo, Widodo gets 55% in presidential election and Prabowo gets 45%. But that's in a contestation between two individuals. In the parliamentary election, Gerindra also only gets what, 9-10%. Prabowo, for his own party, can only get 9-10%. So I don't think the cronies actually have shown they can mobilize large numbers of people. The Islamists can, because they go with a perspective for the future. It might be a perspective, if analysed, doesn't have much content, just caliphate, but what? What's that mean? Actually, in labour, in economics, what's it mean? Although if you go to their website, you actually get much more material. For example, Hizb ut-Tahrir's view on trade unions was, if the caliphate was established, all trade unions would be banned. They state that explicitly on their website, their Bahasa Indonesia website. So I don't think the cronies could do it. And of course, the election shows Widodo can also get 50% in the presidential election. We have to remember, in the parliamentary election, Widodo's party only got 20-something%. So none of them really, whether you represent the cronies or whether you represent the Kabupaten capitalists, the basic trend of all political parties in Indonesia since 1998 is to get less votes every elections. Only one kind of party gets more votes. That's the new party, because the previous election it got 0%, and then it gets 5% or 8%. No party, PDIP, no party has consistently increased its votes. All the votes go down, which is made possible because there's new parties emerge, so that the vote gets divided up. No one's popular. No one's really popular. Widodo is popular in a situation where there's no one else, and he's not corrupt. So there's nobody else, and he's not corrupt. So okay, who else? But even then, he just gets 53%. So if you ask, why aren't people supporting those who stand for the many, I would answer, there is no party that stands for the many.
So the campaign battle is, as you said, is purely, it's more or less superficial, because like, as you said, if you go to the website, you see all the points, there is no substantial points. So I wonder, so in terms of an image, Widodo is a president of the small people, but even then, he's not that much more attractive than this Islamic, this image of promises of Islamic future. So yeah, I wonder.
Yeah. Because Widodo also, I think what will impact on Widodo's own popularity in the next 2 years will be actually the economic outcome. Because you can see now the government is quite concerned. They're trying to avoid admitting it, but it's quite concerned that all the statistics show that the purchasing power of the average person during the last 3 years has gone down. So statistics about infrastructure go up, but the statistics about purchasing power of the ordinary person has gone down. So I saw yesterday that the Minister of Finance, Sri Mulyani, said, we're establishing a special committee to assess whether it's a question of purchasing power of ordinary people perceived to have gone down, or whether it's actually gone down. Because the surveys indicate it's gone down, and questionnaires to ordinary people say it's gone down. But now they're trying, maybe it's not really gone down, maybe it's just people feel it's gone down, but it hasn't. Earlier on, the statement was even more ridiculous. The statistics show that purchasing power has gone down, but that's only because people are buying more things online, which is a ridiculous statement to make in terms of the Indonesian population, most of whom would, you can't buy anything online unless you've got PayPal or Traveloka, and most people in the small towns and villages don't have access. So I think there is an increasing concern that the current government's economic policies are not only not delivering improvement, but actually there may be a slow decline in the purchasing power of the ordinary person. So this question of a vacuum becomes an increasingly pressing question, because who has policies that can change that? At currently in the main stage, nobody. Nobody. So what will happen? I think we'll have to see what extra parliamentary agencies start to impact on the main stage.
So, sorry, Laurie, do you want to, maybe one last question? We've got to get Dr. Lane downstairs by 5:15, so maybe just...
One quick question. I just was curious with your explanation about the, opening up of talking about 65 and what went on, and the not showing of Arifin's film. That's brilliant. It's great that they're not showing that. But do people still feel that the Communist Party was responsible for 65? That they did want to overthrow the government? Has there been any change in that narrative?
I think that's an age question. The younger you get, it's not that the younger you get a different viewpoint. The younger you get no viewpoint. So which is in some ways a positive thing, because it's not, there has to be a process. People aren't going to go from one narrative to another just like that overnight. But I work with teachers high school teachers in Jogja, and high school students, and also first year university students in two of the big universities in Jogja. And basically, you're dealing with young people who on these questions are tabula rasa. And sometimes they are shocked. I give lectures on the history of East Timor, and to convey what the Indonesian military did in East Timor, I would hold up pictures from the Indonesian army of people being tortured, people with their heads cut off, and so on. And if I'd done that 5 years ago, the majority of students would say, foreign propaganda. They would have been defensive. Now, if I do that, half the class will be silent, and the other half of the class, and this is literally, cried. Because doesn't compute. It's not them. They're not like that. And what's this? I make the point to them, which in some way sums up a very unique feature of Indonesia on East Timor. When the Dili massacre occurred in 1991, and when there were photographs and footage leaked from East Timor, I make the point to the students that around the world, millions of people saw those photos and footage on TV, on the TV news, in pretty much every country in the world, except one. When the Dili massacre took place and people were shot and you saw the footage, people in every country in the world saw that on TV, except in one country, Indonesia. Which sums up the weirdness of the situation now, which is why you show them. The young people doesn't compute. They went through all that, and it just was never. It wasn't even there wasn't even enough dissidents there to make that present on the margins. It wasn't even on the margins, or if it was on the margins, it was very, 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 very margins. So tens of millions of people go through 30 years of all sorts of things being done in Indonesia's name, and so it's, I think that's a positive change, because 5-6 years ago, when the New Order propaganda would still be effective, many young people would be defensive. Right country, right or wrong kind of sentiment. But now, no.
This has been a podcast from the Southeast Asia Center. Thanks for listening.